Today we're going to be getting back to the book reviews and we're going to do a nice little review of The Art of Perfumery by Septimus P.S. The cool thing about this book is you can actually download it for free, so stay tuned to find out how. Okay then, so who was Septimus P.S.? Well, Septimus was an English chemist and perfumer who studied at UCL in London, and he was alive in the mid-1800s. Now, the mid-1800s is quite an important time for perfumery because this is really the birthplace of, or the birth time of modern perfumery as we know it today. The reason for that is because this is the first kind of time that synthetics were actually being used in perfumery. Now, the reason that Septimus himself became well known in the sphere is that he'd actually done quite an extensive body of writing regarding how to extract naturals from their plants. Though that said, he also was a bit famous at the time for his perfumery house, which he co-founded, called P.S. and Lubin. And at the time, this made some pretty well-known perfumes. So that's a bit about Septimus, but what about the book itself? Well, The Art of Perfumery is considered Septimus's greatest work, or his magnum opus as such. And the reason for this is it collected a lot of information that would have been extremely hard to come by at the time, and it put it all into one book. The book even states itself that at the time, perfumery in England was virtually non-existent, and for those few people who did do it, they kept it very much to themselves, so it was very much shrouded in secrecy. So suddenly having this book comes out which tells you all of these things, like how to get all the raw materials, how to make different formulas, how to make different products. This is suddenly a massive contribution of knowledge to the field. Anyway, because this book is so old, it's actually now in the public domain. That's something that happens, I think it's 70 years after the authors died, but it effectively means that the copyright on the book's expired. So for you, what this means is if you're interested in downloading the book, instead of having to buy it, you can actually just download it for free off the internet. Anyway, so what's actually in the book? I'm going to go through the chapters of the book and just briefly tell you what's in them and what I think about them, what's interesting, what's not. And then I'll give a quick little summary at the end and give the book a rating. So let's get into it. Okay then, so the first chapter is all about history of perfume. Now, I quite like this from Septimus's point of view, and the reason for that is because often when you get history of perfume in a book, most of it's talking about the 1800s or 1900s. But from the point of view of Septimus, because he's sitting writing this in the 1800s, that means the history that you're getting is actually more things like ancient Romans or ancient Greeks. So he's actually gone and found snippets from ancient Chinese culture, ancient Egyptian culture, that kind of thing, and he's kind of compiled that into a history of perfume. So that's definitely kind of a bit of a fresh perspective, and I think that's kind of interesting. He then goes to talk about the state of perfumery at the moment for him in the 1800s, and what it basically sounds like is that Grasse in France is basically the world capital of perfumery, and he gives the reasons for this as it's got kind of this perfect climate in the sense that you've got the Alps nearby, which are nice and cool, so you can grow violets, which are really nice, but then you just go across and then suddenly you've got this Mediterranean climate and you can grow the perfect orange trees and that kind of thing. Now, the thing about Septimus is he also seems very interested actually about the cultivation of plants for perfumery. He talks a number of times in the book about how he would wish that more land in England was cultivated for use in perfumery, but he even goes on to give examples as places like Iceland where he believes that certain perfumery plants could be grown. So I think it's really interesting to see kind of the way he's thinking at the time of how can we expand perfumery production elsewhere in the world, because that's probably something that not so many people were actually thinking about. Okay then, so next we have chapter 2. Now, chapter 2 really talks about the different methods of extraction of raw materials. So there are 4 main methods at the time that were used, and these were maceration, expression, distillation, and adsorption. So he gives just a really quick overview of roughly how these things are done. Now, if you're someone who likes making your own raw materials, this could be a good chapter for you. And the reason for that is because this book is really when all perfumery was a lot more DIY. So I'm not maybe recommending that you would go and replicate exactly these old methods, but these methods are all things that you could probably do at home if you really wanted to. Next, after chapter 2, we have chapter 3. Now, chapter 3 really talks about all of the natural products used at the time in perfumery, to his knowledge, and it's basically a compendium of information about these naturals. So what he does is he talks about the plants that they come from, he talks about how they're extracted, and then he also gives examples of how they're used in perfumes. And the other thing about this chapter is it's actually quite important to read, because later on when he starts making formulas and things, Some of the things in this chapter are kind of defined, or there are certain bases that he defines as well in this chapter, which could be a combination of 2 or 3 natural materials, and then he goes on to use these later on in his formulations. Next up we have chapter 4, and this is basically the same as chapter 3, but this time it's much shorter, and this is because chapter 4 is just products of animalic origin. He basically gives a really quick overview of how these products are collected from animals at the time. And then he talks about a couple of them. So he says, for example, about ambergris, how it smells kind of disgusting. But he says that the reason people use it is because what it does is it kind of blends with the more volatile notes, and it really helps the perfume stick to things, especially stick to fabric, and makes it really last a lot longer, even after washing. He then talks a bit about civet, and about civet he says, this again smells disgusting, but he's kind of also a bit fascinated how if you smell it at full concentration, it's disgusting, but for some reason, when you dilute it massively, apparently it then becomes quite nice. And yeah, he's a bit fascinated about how this works, because he's obviously thinking, how can this thing, when it's at full strength, be disgusting, but even though you've diluted it and you're smelling it with exactly the same nose, somehow it suddenly started to smell nice. And I guess he's got kind of a fair point with that. Anyway, so then he goes on to talk a bit about musk, and this is not musk as in the synthetic molecule that we're used to nowadays, but it's musk as in musk from animals. And what he basically says about musk is, so at the time in the 1800s, people don't like the word musk. They think it's something that's kind of nasty. So if you tell them that there's musk in a perfume, they immediately say, no, this is not for me. But then he goes on to say, but if you always tell the customer, no, there's no musk in the perfume, but if you put some in anyway, then apparently the perfumes with the musk kind of sneaked inside them always sell much better than the ones without the musk in. So apparently, I guess people just ended up liking the smell of musk, but they didn't think they liked it. Sounds like some unethical marketing is going on here, but 1800s, that's how it goes. Anyway, as much as you think chapter 4 may be a bit unethical, chapter 5 is even more unethical. So chapter 5 is about smelling salts. Now he says, if you want to make some smelling salts, what you got to do is you got to whip up some ammonia, and then you've got to go to your local sponge dealer, get some sponge cuttings, or if you don't want to do that, you can just get some asbestos. And then what you do is you make the perfume, you put it in the ammonia, you put it in the sponge, put it in the asbestos, and you put it in a bottle, and hey presto, you've got some lovely smelling salts. But so I didn't know what smelling salts were, so I had to do a little bit of research on the internet. And what I found out were, apparently smelling salts are like something you like keep around in your pocket. So like when women faint, you can like revive them with it because the smell is so like pungent and disgusting that they like wake up. So then I was thinking, okay, that's a bit weird. Why is everyone fainting in the 1800s? What's going on here? And I did a bit of research. It's a bit sad actually, but what I found out was basically women in the 1800s actually wore these things called corsets, and they would wear them really tight because it would make their waists look smaller. But what it effectively did was it would like cut off their blood supply, so they basically weren't getting enough oxygen, which is kind of screwed up, right? And then they would faint quite easily. The other thing is there was lots of lead and arsenic in the makeup, so that might have like contributed to it a little bit too. I actually found like a really interesting article about this, so I'm going to leave it in the description. If you want to read a bit more about it, you can definitely go check that one out. Anyway, back to normality. Next we move on to chapter 6, and this is a much nicer chapter. This is what you would expect from the book, this is just a wholesome chapter on how to make some nice little perfumes, some little floral bouquets, some handkerchief perfumes, that kind of thing. If you're looking to make some of your own 1800s perfume formulas, then this is the perfect chapter for you. And also, this uses all the things that were referenced or defined in chapter 3. So you might find some things in this chapter that you don't know what are, but usually if you refer back to chapter 3, then you'll be able to work out what they actually are. But it's got some nice little formulas, and it kind of notes the most important or the most kind of impactful formulas at the time. So if you're looking for what was quite influential, I guess, in the 1800s, you'll be able to see which perfume Septimus thinks is most important. And the one thing that he really talks about in this chapter is the importance of the type of alcohol you use. So I guess back in the day when alcohol was produced more from plants, less in a massive industrial way, the quality must have varied quite a lot depending on what you use to make it. So if you use different grains, or if you use grapes or something else to make the alcohol, I guess the alcohol would have ended up smelling a bit different. And he was literally kind of saying in the book, yeah, if you go and use one type of alcohol to make, say, a certain perfume like Portugal water, but then you go and change the alcohol for something else, it will ruin the whole perfume. So I think maybe that's something that's kind of interesting as well in these 1800s perfumes. But maybe that would even apply again today. I don't know. I haven't tried it, but it's possible. Anyway, then, so after this, the rest of the book is quite a few more chapters actually, but they're all talking about how to make a certain kind of cosmetic product or soap or dental toiletries or that kind of thing. To me, these chapters aren't really very interesting, but I guess if you want to make some tooth powder out of powdered cuttlefish, then these are the chapters for you. But yeah, I think maybe to someone who's interested about like cosmetic formulations in the 1800s, this could be some good chapters, but if you're just looking at perfumery, you're probably not really going to be interested in these. Yeah. Anyway, though, that's not quite the end of the book, because even though all of those ending chapters aren't that interesting, there is something at the end, which is the appendix, and this is kind of interesting. And the reason for this is it's kind of just a collection of articles that I guess were like scientific research papers that must have been quite important at the time. But these are kind of interesting too, because it's things like how to stop your perfumes going moldy, things like how to test the quality of soap. There's also articles about creating things like pear drops or apple drops. And when you look at these are actually some of the first little synthetics you can find in perfumery. These aren't naturals, these are actually things made using chemicals back in the day. So again, these chapters aren't really things that are going to be useful to you now as a perfumer, but from a historical point of view, I think they're quite important, because this is the first time that all this stuff like quality control and synthetic products that could be kind of consistently made, or products smelling of things you can't get in nature, this is the first time kind of that these things are really being made, and I think that's kind of says something. It's kind of important, you know? But yeah, so in summary, what did I think of the book? To be honest, if you go into this book and you read it and you're hoping for some perfumery advice, it's not going to be the one for you. I would say if you're looking for a book to help you with perfumery and you want to get started in perfumery yourself, I don't think this is really a good book. I would probably rate it like a 2 out of 10 for modern day. It's not that there's anything wrong with the book, it's just that the content's pretty dated. Most of the raw materials, you're going to be quite hard pressed to find them readily in the modern day. It's going to be a bit more difficult. And the other thing is the English is a bit outdated, so it can be a bit of a struggle sometimes to read it. You can't just read it quickly like you would with a modern book. You have to actually stop and think about the words, and sometimes spend a bit more time just reading the old-fashioned English that is there. That is not to say that I think it's a bad book, actually quite the contrary. I think that for its time, it seems like this book would have been an absolute banger. If you wanted to get started with perfumery in the 1800s, this would have probably been the best, if not at least one of the best books that you could have bought. It would have given you so much information that you really wouldn't have been able to find anywhere else. So I think Septimus probably did a good job with the book. It's just that if you're wanting to start perfumery now, I don't think that it's the book for you. Anyway, that's it for the video. Let me know in the comments if you get a chance to read this book, what you think of it, if you think it's interesting, if you think it's boring. And yeah, that's all I've got to say. So thanks for watching the video. Have a lovely week and see you next time.